Hey there. This time I want to talk about Mrs. Dalloway and Bond Street, the last of our short stories that we have the option of writing about for this essay. So I just want to restate this again, just to make sure we're all totally clear. Your options for this essay, we've now read them all: Mrs. Dalloway and Bond Street, Araby, Evelyn, Dreams, The Stranger. So, yeah, I'm afraid this is going to be one of my like 25-minute videos. So get comfortable. But I think there was just a lot to analyze in this story. I think it interacts in a really interesting way with our other stories, and you guys kind of seem to like this one based on the discussions. This is also the first time that I'm using this story, so I don't know exactly where this is going to take me as I start talking about it. All right, so let's start maybe in the obvious place. Let's look at the title and the first sentence, because I do think that there are some things we can learn here. First of all, the title, Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street. Mrs. Dalloway, right? And that's, I mean, she's sometimes, referred to as Clarissa, but I think she's referred to a lot as Mrs. Dalloway, and I think the fact that that's in the title brings us to that. And I think also the first sentence, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the gloves herself. So I just want to pause on that because we talked about somebody actually brought this up in the discussion and it reminded me of this. We talked about in The Stranger how when Hammond sees when he first meets up with his wife and he's on the boat and he sees her luggage and it says Mrs. John Hammond on it, and how to him he likes that because he's like, oh yeah, she is my property, and it like makes him feel good. And so I think looking at it that way, we're kind of like invited to think about like that sort of thing with a name as just another way that of like the husband possessing the wife or having control over the wife, right? And I mean, to be fair, it's just Mrs. Dalloway. It's not. I think her husband's name is Richard. It's not Mrs. Richard Dalloway, right? So it's not exactly the same. But I think we can see here with that being the title, and Virginia Woolf, probably her most famous novel, is called Mrs. Dalloway, and it's this character, but a whole novel. It's pretty good. I would recommend it. But yeah, so Mrs. Dalloway, that's the name of the novel too. So she's really interested. Like she doesn't call it. It's not Clarissa Dalloway in Bond Street. It's not Clarissa in Bond Street. So I feel like what we see here is like viewing the title like that in more of a positive way. I think that this story, whereas in The Stranger, I think we think about it as kind of a relic of like possessive gender relations, where the husband was thought of as like owning the wife. I think here we see Mrs. Dalloway kind of try to like reclaim this, and I think that really stands in for a lot of the things I'm going to say about the story, about this story's view on the gender roles at the time and the role of a mother and stuff. So yeah, Mrs. Dalloway. I just wanted to point that out. And then this first sentence, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the gloves herself. Okay, I want to dig into this. So first of all, the story's all about her buying things, right? It's her going to the shop to buy some gloves. So I think that tells us something a lot of you guys picked up on was the difference in economic status and class between this and Evelyn, especially. The stranger, not so much, right? I think she was also that family was also kind of upper class when they describe like the clothes that Mr. Hammond's wearing and the fact she went on this cruise. Clearly, Mrs. Hammond does not have a job, and neither does Mrs. Dalloway, right? Whereas Evelyn does. So that is definitely something we see. So it's all about buying stuff, and she would buy the gloves herself. Who's she saying this to? Who's she telling she'd buy the gloves herself? Her husband? Was her husband going to go buy the gloves? I don't think so. I feel like this is something that she said to servants. That was my initial note writing this down. She'd buy the gloves herself, not her husband, but also not the servants. So it doesn't get mentioned explicitly here, but my impression would be that she must have some sort of housekeeper, or maybe probably even more than one. And I guess I'm cheating here. I'm going outside the text, but I think in the novel, Mrs. Dalloway, that is the case. So I think like it's immediately marking. There's so much in just those first few words. It's immediately marking her as embracing the role of wife and mother. It's marking her as being upper class. And yeah, it's marking her as someone who has servants below her, right? So that's just something I wanted to point out. Another thing that I think you guys picked up on, and maybe more in a negative way, the writing style here. So it's similar, I think, to maybe the most to Joyce, to Araby and Evelyn. I think maybe it's the most similar in that there's a lot of specifics, right? We know which street she's on. We know when she's passing Bond Street, when she's passing different street. We know what time of the day it is. We hear Big Ben. So I think it's very grounded in the kind of historical specificity, the same way that Evelyn and Araby are very much we know how much Mrs. Dalloway pays for the gloves, the same way we know how much the boy in Araby pays to get in to the bazaar, the same way that we know how much money Evelyn makes per week, right? So I think the writing style has that. This one, though, I think is more like stream of consciousness. And I think you guys were picking up on this when people were talking about how she appreciates things that might seem meaningless to others, or she notices things that other people don't notice. At least one person I think said that they found it kind of confusing and I thought the story was all over the place. And I think that's all pointing at the same thing, this kind of stream of consciousness, right? We're very much like inside of her head. Um, and that is kind of a development with literature as we get into like the 1920s, where this writing style became a lot more popular. James Joyce did this a lot more in his novels, especially. Like this story is from 1923. In 1922, James Joyce wrote this book called Ulysses, which is like the most stream of consciousness thing possible in a lot of ways. So yeah, it's kind of it's a difference because when we think of the narrator of a story, it's usually like very orderly and stuff, right? And there's a little bit of distance between like what's happening in the character's head and what the story is like telling us, what the narrator's telling us. So I think what we see in this story is an attempt to like break that wall, right? Where all that we have is kind of the character's inner monologue, is a phrase that they use, like the thoughts that are running through the character's head. And for this reason, there's like references that I like. They talk about one time some guy Jack Stewart. I tried to look that up, and it all that came up was like a hockey player from Canada. I don't think that's who they're talking about. So like, I think that's why we see some of these like very specific references that we don't always really even get. So I just wanted to say that about the writing style here, things that we notice. So one of the questions that I've given you on the discussion, and one that I think is interesting, is like, are we supposed to like Clarissa? Is Clarissa supposed to be a hero? I think we talked about how, like in Evelyn or Araby, how those characters are like kind of tragic in a way. Like they, maybe they're learning important things about life. They're not being fooled by idealistic stuff. They're being more realistic now. Um, but Mrs. Dalloway, are we supposed to like her? So I think most of you kind of said, yeah, we are supposed to like her. Like she's smart, she is more joyful. So I think we kind of like those things about her. But like, I don't know. I wonder if this is a problem for us to like look at Mrs. Dalloway as some kind of hero or something. There's a few things. There's a few like I don't know. I don't know if I want to call them problematic, but just like some strange opinions that she has, and some that I don't know if I would give to a hero. Okay, this confused me. I don't necessarily know what to do with this. This is on the top of the second page. Um, and she's talking about, oh yeah, so she's talking about the guy she meets on the street, her friend like Hugh or whatever. I think what she's saying is that she had him over one time at her house, and then she says she had him over, and perhaps one of them couldn't ride. I think she's saying that like he couldn't ride a horse because later on she talks about riding horses and how she likes it. So I think she's saying that like she could ride a horse, but he couldn't. And then she immediately follows that up with how then could women sit in parliament? How could they do things with men? For there is this extraordinary, deep instinct, something inside one you can't get over. It's no use trying. And men like Hugh respect it without our saying it, which is what one loves in dear old Hugh. How then could women sit in parliament? That's kind of a strange question. I think what she's saying is that like men are too sensitive, or like they don't want to be shown up by women, or like they'll feel emasculated or something like that. And where she takes that is how then could women sit in parliament? And I don't know what she's trying to say there exactly. I don't know if she's trying to say that like she thinks for that reason women shouldn't be in parliament, or if she's just like wondering how it'll be solved. I don't know exactly what to do with that. Here's another thought that she has that I definitely recoiled from and was like, well, that's not great. She's talking about, I think she walks past like the palace or something, like Buckingham Palace, and she talks about the Queen, And then she says that the queen means so much to the poor and the soldiers. She says, yeah, it matters so much to the poor, thought Clarissa, and to the soldiers. So I feel like there's kind of I feel like she's kind of condescending, you know? I feel like she is judgmental and condescending, I guess. And I would wonder, like, I don't know, those just seem like strange characteristics to give to someone who we're supposed to like or someone who's supposed to be a hero. So I wonder how much the story like endorses that kind of behavior of like looking down on the poor. Like she's like, oh, silly them, they care about the queen. Someone educated like me could never, take the queen that seriously. I know that it's just a figurehead or whatever, but it's so important to the poor. Like she treats them like they're a different species or like they're animals or just that they're stupid. Um, and like later on, maybe I'll go to this now, even though this is towards the end of the story. There's so when she's in the store and she's buying the gloves, she starts to feel bad for the girl working at the shop. She asks her, "Don't you get fearfully tired standing? When do you get your holiday?" So like she starts to think about like how much it must suck to have to work at a store like this and be on your feet all day and deal with annoying people. She has that feeling for like half a second, right? And then she thinks, well, maybe I should give this girl something. Maybe I should let her go to our country house or whatever. Like, yeah, she talks about like, yeah, because then she asks her when she gets her vacation. She says in September, and then Clarissa starts thinking about how bad it would be. She has a fortnight in Brighton in some stuffy lodging. Nothing would be easier than to send her to Mrs. Lumley's right in the country. So she starts thinking about how she could help this woman working at the shop, how she has the ability to give her a better vacation, how she could do something for her. But then she immediately thinks and says, but then she remembered how on their honeymoon Dick had shown her the folly of giving impulsively. It was much more important, he said, to get trade with China. Of course he was right, and she could feel the girl wouldn't like to be given things. There she was in her place. So was Dick, her husband, right? Um, so that I don't know. That's a sentiment I really don't know if we can get behind. um, like that giving impulsively is bad. It's much more important to get trade with China. So I think within that is like a kind of, I guess I would say, conservative economic position that like the way to help poor people is to have free trade, the way that will help poor people, like, yeah, we're going to send all the jobs over to China or whatever, but ultimately that'll lift everyone up, and the poor people will also be better off. I feel like that's kind of what she's talking about here. And it was in the 20s, so the economics are a little bit different. And then and she could feel the girl wouldn't like to be given things. I feel like that's part of this. I've even seen that in like contemporary stuff when they're talking about like the stimulus checks, for instance, where they're like, "Oh, well, is this a handout? People don't want a handout. That'll make them whatever, like feel like they're not worthy or something. Like people don't want to just be given things, and it's like, no, I'll take the check. Actually, I'll take the $1,400 that was supposed to be 2,000. I'll take the money. I'm not really worried about it. So I think that's another kind of like upper class mentality that like, oh, poor people, like, we can't just give them things like that wouldn't be good for them or for anybody. We just have to get trade with China. And then she ends this thought off by saying there she was in her place, so was Dick. And I don't see any other way you could read that other than, well, she belongs there and I belong here. So I wonder how much that's just like an endorsement of the status quo, where like, yeah, like this woman's poor, and even when she does get a vacation, it's going to be like a dog shit vacation, and she'll stay in a Motel 6 and whatever. And I could help her, but I won't. And ultimately, that's how things should be. She's in her place, and I'm in my place, and my husband's in his place, right? And that's why Clarissa is where she is, because her husband has a lot of money. I think he's a politician or something. Also, her father was a judge. We learn at the beginning. So Clarissa, definitely grew up very wealthy and is still very wealthy. Um, and yeah, so that was on page 5, that part that I was reading from. And yeah, I don't know. I just found that really hard to stomach, and to think like, well, if the story is telling us that we should like this character, like many of you said, most of you said the story wants us to like Clarissa. So what does it mean that the story wants us to sympathize with someone who thinks about poor people this way? I don't know. You can answer that question. Um, all right, let's see. What do I want to look at next? Oh, okay. So in terms of her like us liking Clarissa or her being a hero or whatever, I think because I agree with that point of view that the story does want us to view her that way, and I think the reason we're supposed to view her as a hero also comes later on page 5. So she starts thinking about she starts thinking about if her husband died. She's like, but if Dick were to die tomorrow, as for believing in God, um, she basically she says before that she doesn't really believe in God. Yeah, the last paragraph I was reading ends simply one doesn't believe, thought Clarissa, anymore in God. Um, and then she asks the question. She's thinking about if people die, if none of this means anything, if I don't believe in God, why should we go on? Uh, she says, but why if one doesn't believe? Asking why should we go on if one doesn't believe? Her answer: for the sake of others. And then as she's talking to the woman, skipping down a little bit, for one doesn't live for oneself, thought Clarissa. So I feel like that's kind of what's at the heart of this, that Clarissa lives for others, but that's like a good thing. That's like what makes her happy. She like squares the circle of like living this privileged but kind of meaningless life by living for others. And I think that's, I don't know, maybe the way a lot of us like think about things. We like to have people that we do stuff for and stuff. But it's like, I think it's a way of Virginia Woolf trying to square the circle of the kind of conversation we've been having a lot about the way women were forced to choose between like responsibility or obligation on the one hand and like personal happiness and goals and ambitions on the other. I think that this story tries to find like a synthesis where Mrs. Dalloway is very good at fulfilling her responsibility to others. She lives for the sake of others, but that makes her happy. But that's what she wants. I think another place where we can kind of think about this more is when she talks about this Lady Bexborough that a lot of you highlighted, because she mentions how Lady Bexborough, Clarissa looks up to her in one way because she says that she talks politics like a man, right? And that's something that like Clarissa likes. But then she also says right after that, yeah, she says Clarissa would have given anything to be like that, talking politics like a man. So that's something Clarissa admires. And then the next thought she has, but she never goes anywhere, blah, blah, blah. Then, and the carriage went on, and Lady Bexborough was borne past like a queen at a tournament, though she had nothing to live for, and the old man is failing, and they say she is sick of it all, thought Clarissa, and the tears actually rose to her eyes as she entered the shop. So I don't know what to do with Clarissa's thoughts on this Lady Bexborough, because at one point, on one hand, she looks at her and like her outspokenness and her participation in politics, and Clarissa likes that. She admires that. She's like, I wish I could do that. But then she says she has nothing to live for, and that her husband is dying. And I think that this goes back to what I was just saying about like Clarissa's whole thing of living for others, doing like living for the sake of others, this sort of thing. So basically, Lady Bexborough she views as, yeah, having independence and at least on some extent like moving towards equality with men by being interested in politics and participating in politics. But she also is like, well, yeah, but she doesn't actually have anything to live for because she doesn't have a family to take care of, right? Because she mentions the husband dying. That's why she has nothing to live for. And according to Clarissa, the only reason to go on is for the sake of others and to do things for other people or whatever. So even though Lady Bexborough is able to break out of, or at least in some way, I mean, again, she's also a lady, right? Which that's like an official title that definitely signifies upper class. So, we can think about how that plays into it. But Lady Bexborough is able to be independent, is able to, at least to some extent, overcome some of the sexism to be on a level with men talking politics. But Clarissa doesn't view that. That's not what she wants to do because Lady Bexborough doesn't have a family to take care of. And Clarissa, I think, views that as like really essential. And I think that's the reason that we're supposed to view Clarissa as a hero. And because what is Clarissa doing? Why is she buying gloves? Why is she out shopping right now? Because she's throwing a party. She says at one point that, she says on page 4 also, she would have to order chairs, ices, flowers, and cloakroom tickets, thought Clarissa. And she goes on to say, it would be intolerable if dowdy women came to her party. So she's throwing a party, right? Which I guess we can view as her doing something for other people, even though she must also enjoy the party, right? But I think her position as like host and entertainer is meant to be like her like a role that's independent for her, something she wants to do, but she's doing it for other people, not only her family, but also whoever's coming to the party. And I think we can view that line. It would be intolerable if dowdy women came to her party. I think that there's another judgmental part of her, right? There's a few times where she's like criticizing what people are wearing, or like she sees a woman wearing, or maybe a younger woman wearing makeup or something. I think like eye makeup, and she's like, at this time of day, oh no 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 no, and it's like she's, yeah, I don't know, this kind of like trendy, like upper class fashionista kind of deal, where she really looks down at other people. She doesn't want any dowdy women at her party. It's like, what? It's, yeah, again, very judgmental. And then we can ask the question, like, what does it mean that the story wants us to sympathize, or the story tries to elevate this sort of person, right? Okay, another thing I want to touch on here is how the kind of history of the time period that I think I posted the video on last week enters into the story. There's a few mentions of war. They mostly come towards the end of the story. Clarissa asks the lady at the shop, "Do you remember before the war you had the gloves with pearl buttons?" And then later on, I think the woman working at the shop says something about how like yeah, she says on the last page, page 6, gloves have never been quite so reliable since the war. So the war starts to bubble up, right? And this is written in 1923, once the war is over. I don't know if that's necessarily when it's supposed to take place. I don't know if the war is supposed to be ongoing when we're reading this. But the war kind of comes up in the context of gloves, though, right? Because, you know, in times of war, there's going to be shortages on all sorts of things. Because if you get them from France and France is getting bombed and stuff, you're not getting that stuff, you know? So I think it's like bringing up, I think it kind of shows how uh, World War One specifically kind of penetrated like every aspect of people's lives, from just going to the store. Like even if you weren't at the front or whatever, like clearly Clarissa and none of her family was. Um, then like even if it's buying gloves or whatever, that's I guess the way that it shows up for her. And then in the next paragraph, page 6, she mentions thousands of young men had died, that things might go on. And then we get to this ending that I want to talk about, where it says, there was a violent explosion in the street outside. The shopwoman cowered behind the counter, but Clarissa, sitting very upright, smiled at the other lady. Mrs. Anstruther, she exclaimed. So I liked what you guys were saying about this, how it shows that Clarissa, like she's not phased by it, that she, is able to like not be afraid of this. And I want to add on to that by a few people also noticed how many times they talk about Clarissa sitting upright, or holding herself upright. I think it's at least like 4 or 5 times. So that's an interesting repetition, right? Why keep on telling us about how good her posture is and how upright she holds herself? And I think it's related to the kind of like upper class nature of her, and yeah, why we're supposed to like her and stuff. Like she, is very proper. She always holds herself together, even in the most trying times. So it's not only that she's not scared by this explosion, but what does she do? Miss Anstruther, she's been trying to remember this woman's name, right? There's another woman in the glove store with her, and she was like, I think I know her, but she couldn't remember her name. And then as this explosion happens, the next thing Clarissa does is to remember the other woman's name. So I think that this is again supposed to show us how Clarissa is like the premier host, the ultimate entertainer, who knows everyone's name. Entertainer in terms of like entertaining people at a party at your house, right? How you're like entertaining guests when you have people over for a dinner party or something. Um, so it's like even in the midst of war, she's still the perfect host, even as with this explosion in the street, which, depending on when this is supposed to take place, if it's in the 20s, it could be more related to like Ireland. And like there was definitely a good amount of like terrorism from a civil war that broke out in Ireland in the 1920s, where I talked in the video about Araby about how Ireland was a colony of England, how it was colonized. And in the 1920s is when the Irish War for Independence was happening. So I think that's a possible reading of this, that it could be like some kind of Irish terrorism situation. But yeah, even in the midst of war, of explosions, of all these things, she still is the perfect host who can remember someone's name. And I guess I would ask, is that a good thing? Like, is that something that we should aspire to? Is that something we should hold up? If it's true, again, if the story is trying to present Clarissa as a hero or something to aspire to, what do we make of that? Is that a good message? Is that a bad message? Should we want to be like Clarissa? Um, all right, and then I want to end. Well, maybe I'll look at some of your comments actually, even though I've been referencing them. But I want to end by going back to this question of like traditional gender roles. Do they hold women back, or can they be like used for empowerment? The view of motherhood and stuff like that. So, like I started saying before, I think what Woolf is trying to do here is like cut through this knot, right? Where like Mrs. Dalloway doesn't seem to have to choose between obligation and independence, right? She's able to be a mother to take care of the family, but also to do what she wants and go out by herself. And yeah, I think she seems independent, right? So I like she's happy to live for others, like I was saying. So if her obligation is to live for others, that's also her desire, you know? So it's like finding independence through the traditional gender role or something. And I think the question I'd have to ask about that is, is this only possible because she's rich? You know, like because like if she didn't have servants, would she be so happy to throw parties? If she had to do all of it herself instead of just going to buy the gloves herself, if she has to do all of it herself, would she be quite so happy about it? Would she view it as an empowering thing if it was much more difficult because she didn't have help? If she had a job, would she enjoy taking care of the kids and throwing parties so much? If she had to work Evelyn's job, does this vision of like motherhood as and motherhood and traditional gender roles, does this vision of those things as empowering, does it work if she has to do Evelyn's job? If she has to go to the stores and make minimum wage, 7 shillings a week or whatever, could it be possible to square the circle in the way that Mrs. Dalloway is trying to do here? Is this a kind of feminism or like a kind of gender equality or something that is only available to rich people? And if that's the case, what do we do with that? Because thinking about the stranger, like again, I think the stranger, they're also pretty upper class. And Janie is able to have some independence, right? She goes on a 10-month trip to see the daughter. But then when she comes back, that kind of becomes a problem. It doesn't seem like Mrs. Dalloway's husband is possessive in the way that like Mr. Hammond was. So that's something too. Like, is she just lucky to have a husband who is too occupied with other stuff, who's a politician or whatever? Um, like, is there any reason that Mrs. Dalloway doesn't end up like Janie from The Stranger? Is it just dependent on the whims of the husband, basically? You know? So I think those are some of the things I would look at. But I think we would have to say that this story is definitely, and many of you did say this, that this story is definitely an embrace of traditional gender roles as like being able to provide independence for women. That like it's almost like yeah, Evelyn should just want to do stuff for other people. Like, I don't know, would Mrs. Dalloway view Evelyn as just being selfish because she doesn't want to live for others? Or again, is it only possible for Mrs. Dalloway to do that because of the amount of money that she has? But yeah, I think if like Dreams also, I think had that thing where like the woman in Three Dreams in the Desert, where the woman has to leave the baby behind if she's going to get to the land of freedom. This would seem to be arguing against that, right? It would seem to be like, no, if you live for others and you embrace the role of mother and wife, there's independence to be found within that. And then, yeah, what does it do to that if we say, well, you really can only do that if you're rich, I guess. All right, just one more thing I want to do here. I just wanted to read one comment here from the discussion, and I didn't write down the names. I forgot to do that, so I'm not sure who said this. But they said um, that this story, Mrs. Dalloway, shows us an image of a woman deciding to be different with her own ideas and decisions. And I think it's true that Mrs. Dalloway is the like most optimistic vision of a woman being independent, you know? So I just wonder how we can like take that kind of optimistic view that because in a way it's almost saying that we don't really need to change all that much about society, right? In a way, it's saying that there's nothing fundamentally broken with gender roles because it's showing us a woman who fits into the traditional gender role, but that's a good thing. To Mrs. Dalloway, being the traditional wife and mother is all she could ever want. It's the highest thing that you could aspire to. And it does, but she's not dependent though, right? She is independent and she does do things her own way. So it's not like she is, like she seems to have some level of equality with her husband, right? Doesn't seem like the husband orders her around or treats her bad or anything like that. But it also would suggest that that if women have a problem, that if women aren't gaining equality, it's not the fault of gender roles, right? It's not saying, well, sexism and gender roles are keeping you from being independent because Mrs. Dalloway's independent. So I wonder if the story is kind of saying it's your own fault or something, or um, or just that that's your place, right? Just like the woman who works at the shop, that's her place, and I have my place where I'm rich. Same thing where the women who are abused by their husbands and who aren't allowed to be independent and who have to sacrifice themselves for the family. Well, that's their place and this is mine. I don't know. That would kind of be my argument, I guess. I kind of I don't know. I view this as kind of a negative message, I guess, where it's like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with traditional gender roles. You just have to find a way to work within them to still get your own independence. I don't know exactly what to do with that. All right, so I hope you got something out of this, and yeah, see you soon.